Hey everybody, this is Jeremy with the Next Big Idea Club, and I'm here with John Cagg. He is the author of the recent Next Big Idea Club finalist, Six Souls, Healthy Minds, How William James Can Save Your Life. So John, thank you for joining me.
Thanks so much for having me.
Of course, of course. Been looking forward to this one. Yeah, as we were talking about before we went live here on Zoom, your book is definitely one of the favorites that we've featured as a finalist. You know, for me anyway, I immensely enjoyed it, and I'm really glad that we can share it with our members. But yeah, just to start, I guess I have to start by asking, how are you doing with all this coronavirus craziness? Are you and your family staying safe?
We are safe and sound for the most part. I had unexpected bypass surgery this spring, and
Oh my gosh, you did.
yeah, the message from William James became more urgent about life's worth. but
Wow, yeah.
but my health and my family's health is now good. So thank you for asking. I hope you're the same.
Yes, yes, yeah, doing all right. But yeah, I'm very happy to hear that it sounds like you've recovered well from the surgery and you're doing okay. So now let's just let's dive right into the book here, because our club has featured so many works that focus on psychology, but it's often the latest psychology, the latest research, and you're taking us back a little bit to the founding father of psychology and William James. So I guess my first question is, how did this book come about? Like, what inspired you to write it?
Yeah, I mean, it's interesting because William James is the founder of empirical psychology in the United States, but he's also the founder of American pragmatism, which is oftentimes considered the American philosophy. And ever since I was 18 and I started into philosophy, I've been attracted to thinkers that can basically help me figure out the business of living and also help me figure out my own psychological and social state. I've struggled with depression and anxiety for much of my life, and I gravitate toward thinkers who give me a way of thinking about human nature and human psychology in ways that are very practical. So I gravitate toward Ralph Waldo Emerson, Walt Whitman, Henry David Thoreau, Friedrich Nietzsche, and lately William James. And really to the question that James expresses in 1895, is life worth living? And I think James's answer, I used to think when I was a teenager, it was a bit of a cop-out. But now when I think about James's answer, James says, maybe. Is life worth living? Maybe. It depends on the liver. And I thought that that was a really interesting answer, especially since I've, went through my 30s and I'm now 40. I think it's one of the best answers that the history of philosophy has to offer us.
Absolutely, and we can dive more into pragmatism in a little bit. As you point out in the book, it's a philosophy that kind of grapples with the messiness of life, and so that maybe feels, while it might seem like a cop out initially, I totally agree with you that ultimately it's perhaps the most satisfying and most true to life answer that there is. But yeah, we can talk more about that shortly. So when it comes to William James himself, I know here on the cover we have kind of a striking image of James, in misery. It looks like, really, and you write that for James, philosophy was not this kind of cerebral, abstract, puzzle solving. It's really about figuring out how to live and how to save his own life, really. And so why did William James's life need saving?
That's a great question. I mean, usually we think about philosophers sitting like this, right?
Right.
But William James, that picture on the front cover of the book is a self-portrait. And what I left out of that self-portrait on the cover is over him, James wrote, "Here I and sorrow sit." And James struggled with the thoughts of suicide throughout the 1870s. And he was, during that time, and I believe actually through his entire life, what he later called, in the varieties of religious experience, he called a sick soul. And this is one of those people, and there are many of us out there, that feel like the universe is just out of joint with us, that we don't quite fit. Existential angst, existential anxiety, the feelings of, and Nietzsche would call it the horror of existence, sometimes resonates with us a little too forcefully. And James felt that through his 20s and 30s. James was born into a life of privilege, which you would think, well, come on, poor little rich boy. But freedom, the type of freedom that James had to pick whichever way he wanted to go in life, actually spawned a debilitating anxiety in him, and a concern about whether he was actually psychologically and existentially free. And because he oftentimes didn't feel that way, that he felt like his life was oftentimes controlled by forces that were beyond him. And that's an experience that many of us have, many of us who are born into privilege, and then also many of us who are not. And James is speaking to us, trying to figure out ways that we can reclaim our lives. And I think that that's one of the things that James has done for me. He doesn't save your life like you're on an actual life preserver, but he might actually explain why our lives, which seem so fragile and ephemeral at times, aren't a complete waste of time. And I think that that's what James is up to in most of his philosophy.
Mm-hmm. No, that makes a lot of sense. And yeah, I really appreciated how deeply you dove into some of James's concerns and how ultimately he, decided to cope with them. I feel like I also have had, certain mental health troubles over the last few years in particular. And I really liked reading about this stuff. I felt like it gave me a new perspective on that. And in particular, I loved this notion that James had of this this will to believe, this idea that unless I'm, and please feel free to correct me if this isn't quite right, but this notion that overcoming whatever ails you, whatever it is that makes you a sick soul, starts with the belief that you can indeed overcome it, as opposed to looking for evidence that you can and then acting on it. You sort of have to act first. Is that do I have that right?
You too. And I mean, just to give a little bit of the backstory, I mean, James is struggling with what's usually called the dilemma of determinism. Determinism is just the idea that every event is caused by a previous event, and even our decisions are caused by events that we don't author ourselves. In other words, my life is determined fully by a deep history that I have no control over. And this dilemma of determinism sort of struck thinkers like James particularly pointedly in the 1860s in the wake of Darwin's Origin of Species. Because Darwin basically says, we, human beings, are no different than any other natural organism, and we operate by natural laws that determine our lives. Now, James, working in the 1870s, was terrified of this idea, in part because what it implied is that we don't author our lives and therefore we're not responsible for our lives. James responds with what you described as the will to believe. And he read a gentleman by the name of Charles Renouvier in 1873, read an essay on liberty. And Renouvier basically says, your first act of free will is to believe that you are free. You've got to fake it till you make it. It's a sort of philosophical bootstrapping exercise. James takes this idea of the will to believe and he imports it into a really robust philosophical point, I think, in the 1890s, which is this, that he says that when evidence is lacking about particular questions, those questions that we consider most interesting to us, most valuable, so questions about whether I'm a good person, should I act morally, should I fall in love, do I love this person, do I want to be friends with this person, do I believe in God, is God real? These questions cannot be solved just on an empirical basis. And James says that in those cases, it is justifiable to believe, to will yourself to believe in something. And it seems like that sort of is it violates the philosophical mandate to wait until justification is supplied
Right.
and then believe something.
Right. Right.
James says if you do that, you might never fall in love, because
Wow.
you can keep accumulating evidence, but the evidence doesn't, the skies don't open and answers don't come uh,
Hmm.
about these existential questions. James says you better act. And you better will yourself to believe. And then James says something pretty miraculous, which is the belief itself changes the universe and changes the world in such a way that it makes your belief more likely to be true.
Wow.
And I think that that's a really deep thought for people who are suffering from depression, for people who are going through divorce. I've been through two. For people who are suffering from mental health or physical ailments. Um, James says, act and believe, and maybe the universe will adjust itself to your will. Um, so and I think that's a really powerful point.
It really is. It really is. And man, there's so many directions I want to go with this because I feel like we could have a whole conversation about this point alone. Like for example, it reminds me a little bit of Kierkegaard's like leap of faith thing, where he's like, you know what, like if you're not sure, you sort of got to start by willing yourself to believe a certain thing, and then the rest kind of follows. Is that a fair comparison, do you think?
It's a very fair comparison. Um, and I think that thinkers like Kierkegaard, writing in the 1840s, Emerson, writing in the 1840s, Nietzsche, writing in the 1880s, reading Emerson, and then James, reading Nietzsche and Emerson. Uh, these thinkers believe that the leap is required first, and that rationality always has a sentiment behind it. James calls it
Hmm.
sentiment of rationality, that has to do with your will and not necessarily with the formal logic of decision making.
Very interesting. Very interesting. Yeah. No, that's so cool. And I feel like what's particularly powerful about this idea is that it applies not only to the biggest questions that are known to man, like is there a God or are we free? But it also has very real, concrete, practical utility. I think you give the example in the book of love and romance, right? Where if if in my case, well, I'll give you an example. I've been dating my girlfriend Tina for the last couple years, and we're very close. And I remember the day that we met. We were both at a party, and I was actually about to leave, and I just hear my name called from like across the room, and I sort of like spin around and I try to figure out who said that, and sure enough, it was this girl that I'd never spoken to before. And she later told me, she's like, I really don't know what possessed me to call out your name like that. I had no idea what I was doing, and I had no reason to believe that you'd be interested in talking to me or you're going out with me. But I just kind of did it. I just kind of acted. I don't know why, but it worked out. And I think, and I see a direct parallel to this idea where if you wait for evidence that, okay, yes, this person definitely wants to go out with me, they would love to get coffee with me, etc., that can work, but that evidence may also never come. Sometimes you just need to act and seize the moment because opportunities are so fleeting. And lo and behold, in her taking that leap of faith and trying something totally crazy with no evidence to support her hopes, it really did work out. And here we are 2 years later. So do you feel like that is an accurate representation of that idea manifesting in everyday life? And if so, where else might we find it?
I do. I mean, James um, gives this example of the will to believe, where he's mountain climbing. James was a big hiker, and he reaches this gap, this crevasse, and he's not sure whether he's going to be able to clear the crevasse, to jump the crevasse. And he has no choice but to try. He's stuck, basically. And James says, you have to believe that you can make the jump, or you most certainly won't make the jump.
Yes.
Now you believing that you'll make the jump doesn't guarantee it's going to happen. Okay.
Right.
But if you don't believe, it certainly won't happen. And this is the same sort of situation that James time and again says. He says about the issue of God, about the issue of religious belief. If you're not sure, if you're agnostic about this, but that's fine. Remain that way. But he says, if it is a pressing issue for you, you can believe in God or transcendence or some higher power. And the belief itself may change the universe such that it becomes a more accommodating place to your soul, basically. And I think that that's a point that many depressives and many people suffering from anxiety also feel, which is to say, what you don't want to do if you are in the bouts of suicidal depression is get out of bed. And James says you have to believe that you can. And you can fit, my mom would say, fake it till you make it, until you make it. Like you just fake it. And then sometimes that act of faking it changes the world and changes your emotional disposition. And I think that that's an interesting point. So James would say, get out of bed, look up, open your glottis. He's enough of a physiologist. Say, open your chest, breathe deeply, and it oftentimes changes your emotional response. That's at the basis of the James Lang theory of emotions, which is that you act first, and then you feel the response of that action. Don't wait for the emotion to come around. Act first.
Right. Yeah, there is a bidirectionality there between the action and the physiological responses and the emotional responses. The causal relationship does go both ways, and that's so cool that James had that insight so long ago that is now really being borne out by the evidence. And as maybe a one last aside about this point before we move on, and for the members watching on Zoom and on Facebook, I want you to keep this idea in your mind for when we tackle Humankind by Rutger Bregman. Are you familiar with Humankind, John?
Yeah.
So in the book, we're about to read it. Probably, I think next month is going to be the time that we focus on it in the club. And he makes this point that, if you believe, which is the fundamental thesis of his book, that people are much more cooperative and kinder and warmer than we usually give them credit for. If you start with that belief and you act on it and you design your institutions around that assumption, you really do bring that out of people, like it's by starting with that belief, you do make it much more likely that actually comes to pass. And I think I see a direct parallel with what he's saying to what James is saying and what you're saying here. Is that a fair comparison, do you think?
Absolutely. I mean, James says quite explicitly, if I go about my social interactions with the presumption that people will like me and that I am likable and that I can be kind and that that will be a reciprocal response, you are much more likely to craft a society and also to live in a social situation that bears this out. Now, one of the criticisms of James might be something like, well, you're a white man born into millions. Like, of course you think that the universe is going to comply.
Revolve around you. Yeah.
Revolve around you. And that's that's a really trenchant critique of James. But I still think that James would say, even if you are not born of privilege, maybe if you're absolutely, born into an opposite situation, this still may work for you. And I think that this is the case. He says in the Gospel of Relaxation, he talks about women, Norwegian women, who had often been acclimated to just stay at home, to be what he calls peaceful tabby cats. And James says that the physical activity of Nordic skiing transformed these women's lives. It wasn't like that they had a consciousness raising moment and they thought, oh, women are oppressed. They just
Right.
they went and started skiing, and they realized that their lives could be so much richer and so much stronger than what
Mm,
their culture was bringing them up to think of themselves. And I think
right.
that James was sometimes aware of this. He wasn't great on it, but he was sometimes aware of this.
Gotcha. Gotcha. Yeah, that's such a cool example. So I do want to move on a little bit because
Sure.
there are so many other great insights from your book, and in particular, I want to address what James called the secret of being, which I thought was just such a profound point, and I actually marked the place in your book where it's mentioned because I thought it was so interesting. Um, it's yeah, it says here, the secret of being, in short, is not the dark immensity beyond knowledge, but at home, this side, beneath the feet and overlooked by knowledge. Now, this strikes me as kind of a strange thing for a philosopher to say, right? Because a philosopher, by definition, their job is knowledge. You know, that is it. And here is James, the father of American philosophy, saying, no, no, no. The secret of being, not about it's not about knowledge. It's about it's about what's right here. It's what's overlooked by knowledge. So yeah, can you develop that point a little bit? What was James getting at?
Sure, I can try. So Ralph Waldo Emerson was William James's intellectual godfather. And Emerson, the touchstone for Emerson and the Transcendentalists that preceded James's philosophy was this concept of experience. It's basically coming to your own experiences, to your own, to the experience of your community, to the experience of the natural world, to the experience of the cosmos. Coming to, basically, the idea of waking up to
Mm,
experience. And that experience is always, it doesn't forsake us in our darkest moments. The sort of spontaneity of experience, the creative potentials of experience, the opportunities it affords, the right now, the present. If we're talking about timelessness, you know, just go to the present. That's the timeless
mm,
For both James and Emerson. And I think that what James is doing is trying to think about transcendence in a new way, in a way, well, in a way that maybe not is not new in the 19th century, but it's new in the history of um, institutional religions,
mm,
with the exception of maybe the mystics, who sometimes
mm,
fall outside of institutional religion.
mm,
James is trying to think through um, what experience can give us, but also
mm,
what we can give experience. This sort
mm,
of bilateral, this feeling of being, having an experience is both an active and a passive moment. And one where when I say to my students, where do you find yourself? Where do you quote find yourself?
mm,
They're like, well, in basketball, in making music, in these creative experiences. And then I say to them, where do you lose yourself? And they see
mm.
exactly the same experiences.
Wow.
And James is tapping in on this. He's like, um, he says there is an experience that religious men and women, I would add, have, where we can be as nothing in the water spouts of God. And that experience doesn't necessarily happen at a mosque or a temple or a church or a synagogue. It happens in the world. And it happens when we allow ourselves to engage the world in radically open ways that
Mm,
where we experience life's contingencies, its possibilities, its maybes in real ways. And I
mm,
think this is what James is saying. He does this. I mean, the secret of being, that quote comes after he's used nitrous oxide, and
fair enough.
and he experiments with hallucinogenics actively in order to open his mind, way before Michael Pollan did it. All right.
Yep. Yeah. Or Aldous Huxley, right?
Or Aldous Huxley, for that matter. Right.
Mm.
So he's open to trying to open your mind, I guess.
Right, right. No, that's so cool, and it reminds me of a quote from Alan Watts, the Buddhist philosopher, and I'll probably totally mangle the quote, but it was something like, Zen is not thinking about God while peeling potatoes. Zen is just peeling potatoes, and I think it speaks to this idea that these things that so many people spend their lives searching for, especially philosophers, but I think all of us, like truth and beauty and meaning. These things can be found in just the present moment if we're willing to engage with it, and it doesn't have to be. It's probably easier to find those things when it's a creative pursuit like basketball or playing music or whatever, but it can also be during the more mundane things if we bother to pay attention, even if it's just peeling potatoes. Do I have that right?
Yeah, I mean, James is about the sacred nature of the mundane. And,
Mm.
this is why he liked hiking so much. He said that he experienced God when he was up in the Adirondacks,
Mhm.
uh, lying with a close friend of his, an adjacent soul, on the
Mm.
ground.
Wow.
And it wasn't sexual. It was just they
Sure.
were having this like communion with nature and with each other. And
Mm.
what's interesting is that during this pandemic, we've seen, or I've seen, more and more people walking outside, laying on the
Mhm.
grass, laying 6 feet apart quietly. Like, I mean, I'm thinking the pandemic has been terrifying and horrible in many ways,
Mm.
but
Mm.
it also has given us the ability, or given us the chance to think through our relationship to the natural world in a sort of new way. At least it is around what's happening around my house.
Right.
And I think that that's a benefit, maybe one of the few silver linings of this time.
Definitely, definitely. And maybe as a final addition to this point, before I ask you about something new, it reminds me of another Kierkegaard quote where, and maybe this means something else in context, but he said, life is not a problem to be solved, but a reality to be experienced, and I think that really resonates with a lot of these ideas that we're talking about, which is, if you're looking for meaning and truth and beauty, it's just kind of found right here beneath your feet, overlooked by knowledge, as William James might say.
Right.
Um,
I think that's spot on.
cool. Excellent. Excellent. I'm always concerned about, I have this perpetual fear of quoting philosophers like out of context, because I'm like, oh man, that probably means something completely different from like what.
James,
So that's why I'm always checking.
James says, "Be not afraid of life."
Yeah.
And, I mean, yeah, and that's one of the things that I've definitely learned from James too. Be not afraid of life, even the most torturous parts of it. So,
I love that. I love that. All right, I'll be sure to keep that in mind. So next, I definitely wanted to get to pragmatism, which we mentioned earlier, but I think it's such a core, important through line through your book and also through William James's thinking, of course. And maybe by way of introduction to the idea, there was another great quote that I found from your book about what makes it such a powerful way of thinking. And he was saying, yeah, you say, in James's words, he wanted to provide a way of thinking between the tough-minded scientist and the tender-minded idealist, preserving what is valuable about both sides. So what exactly is pragmatism, and how does it accomplish that goal?
it's interesting. James calls it a new name for a very old way of thinking, which is, let's go this way. So he says that pragmatism stems from the pragmatic maxim, the idea that truth should be judged on its practical consequences. But then the question is, what are those consequences? So it's a philosophy, it's a way of thinking that takes seriously, it basically asks what truths come out of experience And then how can truth enrich experience?
Mm,
So the ideas that we have in life, how can they enrich our experience? And how do our ideas emerge from our experiences as individuals and the communities in which we live? The
mm,
consequences of or rather the consequences of truth are not just evaluated on the basis of a single individual, but in terms of wider concentric circles. You might think of Emerson's famous essay, Circles.
mm,
So the individual, his or her community or family, his or her community, his or her political situation, his or her global situation, and his or her cosmic situation and
wow.
spiritual situation. And the consequences that the truths that we have develop and transform, the consequences of those are to be evaluated in in terms of wider concentric circles.
Mm,
So pragmatism often gets criticized for being a crass instrumentalism, that it's a philosophy that says that truth is what works for you or
mm,
me, and the pragmatists would never say that.
mm,
So C.S. Peirce, William James would say that we are in a community of inquiry, and we're in the process of interpretation. And our truths, it's not simply that they can be whatever I want or whatever you want, okay, a sort of crass subjectivism or instrumentalism, but rather that they can be flexible depending on the needs of a community, depending on the needs of ever widening communities of interpretation.
mm,
And I think that that's a really interesting evolutionary take on truth. In other
mm,
words, it is a marketplace of ideas, but is it a broad marketplace? It's the broadest possible marketplace over the broadest possible time horizon.
mm.
James and Peirce both think that we are after, asymptotically, truth in the long run. But man, can we mess up in the process of getting there? Okay, but the arc of truth bends toward, well, it's way out there,
Yeah.
um, and individuals should be humble about any universal truth claims. He's lived through
Mm,
the Civil War. He thinks that ideology and absolute truth are what get you into war.
mm,
And so it's a sort of more modest take on truth, but truth in
mhm.
the long run, directed toward truth in the infinite long run.
Gotcha, gotcha. Yeah, so I feel like pragmatism is, on the one hand, it's so in line with the scientific method in the sense that because you're evaluating the validity of truth claims in so many different scales in so many different places and communities, that I feel like it's almost like having a huge sample size for like a study. Um, but then on the other hand, it does seem so adaptable and flexible in the sense that it does take into account the experience of the individual as well. It seems almost like a democratic approach to truth claims. Unless I'm kind of misunderstanding that, could you
No,
maybe ground this in
you're not
does that sound right so far?
you're not misunderstanding it at all. So C.S. Peirce writes a seminal essay called "The Fixation of Belief." It's considered one of the sort of first essays on pragmatism. And C.S.
Mm,
Peirce is one of William James's friends and mentors.
mm.
Peirce says that pragmatism is the hypothetical method, is the scientific method. Uh,
Oh, great.
so it's the process of hypotheses, testing hypotheses. Peirce would call it abduction, hypothesis formation, testing hypotheses, and then coming to provisional conclusions which can guide action and then can be amended on the basis of future evidence. And that sounds
Mm,
very much like the scientific method. What's different, what pragmatism cautions us against, is two things, I think. One is the scope of the questions that we ask don't need to strictly remain empirically verifiable. And so,
mm,
for example, we can ask questions about the unseen realm. We can ask
mm,
questions about ghosts. We can ask questions about seances. We can ask questions about God or about
mm,
love. Um, so, so the scope is far broader than what most committed scientists are going to take as real questions today. The second issue is that they caution us against scientism, which is to say that science can solve all questions for all time, period.
Yes, yes.
And maybe has already done so.
Right.
And I think that pragmatists, classical pragmatists like James, would caution us against that type of arrogance. And so I think that might be a difference between, some scientists and James. But I think you're right about the scientific method wholeheartedly.
Great. No, that's great. And yeah, I love the sense of humility that comes with pragmatism, and also its ability to tackle these big important questions like, is there a God, for example, right? Whereas a student of scientism might say, well, no, there's not, because science hasn't found evidence for a God, so there's no God, end of story. Whereas the pragmatist doesn't have to make such broad, definitive conclusions, right? I mean, there's really more of a humility there, in a respect for the limits of science. So can you maybe ground pragmatism for us in, I don't know, like a slightly more day-to-day application of how this perspective helps us make better sense of the world?
Yeah, I can. So the first, let's take it straight from the previous discussion about method, and methods about inquiry. Pragmatists are going to say that there is something like truth out there, and that what they're going to do is be highly critical of authoritarian, big government ideologies that seem to govern lives unreflectively. And I think James said, damn great empires. He's going to be highly critical of institutions that limit individuals' freedom, but also that encourage individuals to talk past each other rather than to engage critically with each other. So I think that pragmatism is a type of corrective at a political level.
Interesting.
At an individual and community level, I think pragmatism encourages us to think about life and its amelioration. In other words, pragmatism is about making life better. That's enough, and that's it. And that's different than coming up with better arguments that can be defended from that can be defended at conferences that nobody goes to. Okay. Right. And pragmatism, philosophy, has always been about the public interest and the public good, historically speaking. I mean, the Stoics come from the Greek word stoa, which means these pillars that are in the columns of the marketplace. Like Socrates was so well known that when Aristophanes wrote the Clouds, everybody knew him, right? And so, and when you read pragmatism and when you read James, he's speaking to individuals who want to make life better for themselves, for their communities, and want to think through the thoughtful business of living. And pragmatism in its everyday says, don't overlook the power of experience, 1. 2, come up with better habits of thought. We are habitual creatures. Some habits stultify and deaden us. Others bring us alive and allow us to be more human. Think about habit. 3, they say, think about possibilities. And this is where I think I'm looking at time here, and I know that time is short.
I'm good to go a little bit long if you are, personally.
So think about possibility. We so often live in a very blinkered, very narrow, confined angle of vision. And James says, widen your angle of vision and notice that possibilities are out there that you have neither considered nor explored. And I think that that's something that on a very immediate personal level, that's something that people today living through this pandemic can do. And that's at the heart of pragmatism. It's also at the heart of the scientific method. Hypotheses are maybes. They explore possibilities. And I think that that's a really important testing hypotheses, exploring opportunities, exploring possibilities. That's what pragmatism is about. And it's where pragmatic truth comes from, how it could ever be formed. And it stands to change our lives, I think, and so, in some cases, save our lives. So when William James, I mean, we started there at the beginning of the time when I said in 1895, James gives a lecture to the Cambridge YMCA, and he's asked to address a number of suicides that have taken place on Harvard's campus. And he's asked to address the question, is life worth living? And the Cambridge YMCA probably expected him to simply say yes and then give an answer.
Right.
Because usually we think about this question in two mutually exclusive ways, yes or no. If you say no enough, ardently enough, forcefully enough, you will not be with us very long. If you say yes, you join a host of philosophers that have given really airtight or seemingly airtight explanations about why life is worth living every day of the week, including Sundays. James, who's struggled with depression and anxiety most of his life, says no. The answer is maybe. It depends on the liver. It's up to us to make good on life's possibilities, opportunities, to face its risks, but also to seize its rewards. It's up to us. Yeah. And it also says that those people who can't do it, or who are facing insurmountable odds, are also justified, right, in feeling the way they do, and in some cases opting out of life's turmoil, which is a completely different way of thinking about the question, is life worth living, than someone like Kant, who says it's just universally impermissible for us to take our own lives. What James says is, no, it is permissible. You are free. You are always free to make good, to choose. Always free. I mean, James's philosophy of freedom would insist on that. But I've found that when I'm considering jumping or, shuffling off this mortal coil, I have found James's maybe to keep me there longer than Kant, for the following reason, is that James is saying, I believe you. I know you're having these experiences. Think about the maybe. Maybe life is worth living. It's up to you. It's up to you to jump. It's up to you to stay. You can always jump tomorrow, right? I mean, it's always up to you. Okay, and I think that this is a beautiful way to keep people from the edge, okay? Right. Because it says, you have the ability to do this. You always do. It's a trapdoor if you want it. It's right there, okay? But maybe you can seize life's possibilities, okay? Maybe. I mean, and maybe not, okay? But and I think it's beautiful. I think it's something that just keeps sick souls here a little longer. And I think that, sorry, I'm going on at length, but I feel very strongly about this, is that James says life is full of maybes. And if you don't think that maybes are worthwhile, you should think about all the maybes that you've explored that have made your life meaningful. And I'm like, what do you mean by that, James? He means something like this. I say to my students, why do you play a sport? Do you, if the game was decided beforehand and you knew the outcome, would you play it? Or is it the maybe? Maybe I'll win, maybe I'll lose. There are possibilities. Who knows how it's going to go? Maybe that's what keeps you into the sport and keeps it interesting and meaningful. So too with love. Like, would love be interesting if I knew how it was going to go all the time? No, I'd kill myself. I mean, I'd kill myself if there are no maybes left, James. Right. I mean, I think that's just something that I've never heard somebody articulate the way James does. That life is meaningful because there are contingencies and possibilities. Not because it's not that life is not meaningful, because it's just up to a maybe. It's meaningful because of the
Mm,
maybe. So
right.
and now I've gotten way up on my James soapbox. So I'll
No,
come.
I love it. No, John, that was really beautiful, man. I mean, it really was. That was like I loved that. Thank you for that. And I so fully agree. And this is, one big reason why, as much as I do have lots of curiosities about science, mathematics, philosophy, all these things that are ostensibly trying to figure everything out, and kind of like remove all the maybes from the world. Um, I find that process, that goal, to be kind of abhorrent. I think it's the maybes, the possibilities, the mysteries, the things that we don't quite know and can't quite predict. Those are the things that make life exciting, and I don't want those things to be stamped out by someone like Richard Dawkins saying, no, there's definitely no God, just to throw one example out there. I think he's kind of just spoiling the joy of existence by making such firm declarations that leave no room for mystery or possibility. And so I think a healthy respect for those maybes and for those possibilities, I think that offers a sense of hope, right? For people who do feel like they are sick-souled, and are unsure if they'll ever climb out of that pit. It seems like those maybes, they offer the possibility for a ladder up and out. Would you say do I have that right?
Yeah, I would say that's what I think James is doing for us. Yeah, definitely.
Mhm. Great, great. Well, as maybe a final question for you here, John. I think that the one other thing that James mentioned in this book was his concept of zest and finding joy and meaning in the present moment. So as maybe a parting thought, what exactly is zest, and how would you recommend that our viewers go out and try to find some?
It's good. Um, so I think so. He says in this essay, what makes life significant. He
Mhm.
says at the end of the day, it's the zest. This word with an unknown origin. It's a weird word.
Mhm.
Um, it's so zest is the sort of energy that we have when we engage the world in ways that we turn ourselves over to the world, and that the world then takes something of us. And
Mm. We
it's
find and lose ourselves
where
simultaneously,
we
maybe.
find and lose ourselves. That's the zest. Okay. And the the closest that you can kind of think about it is when somebody says, God, that was something, right? That
Mm.
feeling of like, oh, this, right? There's no way to. What's curious is that it's anti-philosophical in a certain sense because it defies explanation. Okay,
Mm.
this, you can point to it, but you can't explain it.
Mm.
But what I will say is that people can do it and find it as long as they are still conscious.
Mm.
Um, and that consciousness is hellish in certain ways, like
Mhm.
as Dostoevsky suggests in Notes from Underground. But consciousness is also transcendent, and it
Mm.
allows us to experience the world anew. Now, how the question is, how do you do that?
Mm.
So, one thing that I learned from a friend, Aki Bush, who wrote a really nice book called How to Disappear,
Whoa.
is to disappear. And what she means by that is break out of your normal habitual lives. Go, go by yourself, okay? And be
Mhm.
quiet and try to listen to the world and listen to yourself. It's scary, but you
Mhm.
can do it. And you'll discover that the world is there to provide zest and for you to engage and have zest.
Mm.
Um, but we need to get out of this constant buzz that occupies our mind. So that's one
Mm.
thought. And James would suggest that that was definitely the case. I mean, he has a place up in he had a place up in Socorro in New Hampshire, and he had to go there and live what he called an animal life at least 2 months a year, or he'd go insane, he said. So that's one. The second thing is that many of the things that frighten us the most deserve our immediate attention and have the potential to give zest. And so you might want to think, when your girlfriend called to you from across the room, I bet she was petrified but she was both petrified and thrilled. And she could have been petrified and remained petrified, but the zest wouldn't have happened. So be aware that fear is a sign that something needs to be explored further. And you can explore it intellectually, you can explore it experientially, but fear is instructive. So those would be my two: disappear and attend to the fear.
Wow. It even rhymes. How about that?
Yeah.
What a great way to wrap things up. Well, everybody, as you know, the book is Sick Souls, Healthy Minds. We have a mini course on the book available right now in the member library. But I implore you, please go pick up a copy from bookshop.org or your local store if it's open. But until next time, John Kag, thank you so much.
Thank you. This was fun.